There are no monsters lurking in the woods or under the sea. There are only beasts in the gnawing pulse of life, the eternal cycle of eating and being eaten, and the sharp teeth of the hungry, and the gentle hearts of the weak. Dr. Jim Dunham. The summer sun beat down on the blacktop of a single-lane road winding into the Arkansas hills, radiating in waves of shiny vapor and washing everything in white heat that made Jim Dunham squint. There were no street signs, no landmarks, and no service. The land dipped and climbed into indistinguishable rolling hills of brown brush and thick trees. He unfolded a map onto the hood of his rental car and tracked his finger along the highlighted route. He was used to being lost. A career of researching strange sightings had taken him to far-flung places all over the world. Patience was key. He took a deep breath and swiped away the beads of sweat forming on his forehead. He'd been in the Ozarks for 6 weeks, chasing down interviews with Sasquatch witnesses. For a new book, he was writing on the phenomenon of monster myths in the American rural communities. This would be his last interview before returning home to Connecticut. He'd set up an interview with a bow hunter who had fallen from his tree stand and allegedly met Bigfoot face to face. Jim could have done the interview over the phone, but he liked to form in-person connections with the people he talked to. To truly understand the formation of mythology, he was understanding the setting of its origin. There was invaluable context to be gathered by stepping into the subject's world, to breathe their air, eat their food, and sit in their living room. And so he agreed to make the 45-minute drive to the hunter's home, which was a dirt road somewhere branching off the main interstate. It ain't on Google Maps or anything like that. But if you got a road map, I can show you how to mark it, the bow hunter said in a molasses-thick twang. While scratching his head in the heat, Jim chuckled a bit as it occurred to him that the whole call might have been a hoax. Maybe there was no bow hunter, no dirt road. He prepared himself for that eventually. Hoaxes were part of this business. People in modified gorilla costumes, badly sewn taxidermy, trumped up hairstyles. He looked at the map and again at the dry hills. One stray spark and this entire place would go up, he thought to himself. He entertained this fantasy as he folded up his map and mentally prepared himself for the drive back to his hotel. The sound of an oncoming car caught up to his attention. A truck turned the corner and pulled up next to him. It was an old Tacoma, lifted and stripped of its bumpers. A sun-worn face poked out of the driver's side window and released a stern of chew, spit, and facial recognition on the roadside. Jim Dunham. His face was friendly with a good-natured grin that put Jim at ease. That's me. Jim met the man's smile. We spoke over the phone. I'm Frank. Figured you might get turned around out here and decided to come looking for you. Well, you're just in time. It's a good thing, too. Roads get pretty bumpy up ahead. I got my doubts your little silicone slipper right there is going to make it up that, he said, pointing out Jim's Prius and shooting off a friendly wink. Why don't you follow me up a road a ways? There's a wider shoulder to park on, and then I'll take you the rest of the way. Why not? Jim said with a casual shrug. He'd come this far. The turnoff was half more of a mile down the road. He was pretty sure the silicone sipper wouldn't have made it either. Calling it a dirt road would be generous by any standard. It was actually more of a narrow, steeply graded climb into the hillside. He counted several half-exposed boulders in the last few feet. "Jump in," Frank said with another quaint hill country smile. Jim braced himself as the cab tossed violently up the path. Empty cans of beer and chew rattled like dice on the bare metal floors. After a mile or so, the road smoothed into a dirt clearing surrounded by tree line. A small trailer sat near the edge. "How the hell did you get that thing up here in one piece?" Jim asked. "It took some doing." Frank disappeared through the trailer's small doorway and returned with a cooler and 2 camping chairs. "You don't mind me talking outside in the shade, do you? AC's busted, and it stays hotter than hell, or till about midnight." "Cold one?" Frank extended a can of sweating Busch Light. Jim popped it open and took a long sip. He wasn't a beer drinker, but in those hills and that heat, it tasted like the most refreshing thing in the world. They settled in, and Jim started to up his digital recorder. Frank fidgeted, his happy-go-lucky demeanor slipping slightly. "Don't worry about this recording. It's just for notes so that I don't have to stay busy writing during our conversations," Jim said, recognizing the familiar angst he's seen in countless interviewees. There was always a chance they'd change their mind at the last minute. This was the moment of truth. "I'm just curious to hear your story. I've been researching this stuff for most of my life. Just tell me the way you'd tell me if we were just sitting around a campfire." "All this going in your book?" "Yup. And your book is on Bigfoot?" "Not exactly, but you believe in Bigfoot." "I'm open to believing in Bigfoot." Frank's face grew tense. Jim swirled the beer around in his hand, thinking of different approaches to salvage the interview. "Nah. We both know that's bullshit. You think we're all a bunch of country bumpkins making up stories, right?" Frank's posture shifted forward. "I don't think that, no. But I'm also not going to lie to you. I've never seen a lot, and I've never heard a lot, and I'm still not convinced." "I have something that might convince you." "Can I see it?" "In just a bit." Frank pulled his shirt down past his left shoulder. A large scar covered most of the skin. "See this? This is where she got me. A little love bite." "She? You mean a female Bigfoot?" Frank nodded, staring off into his beer. "How did you figure out it was female?" Jim followed up. "Just a feeling, I suppose." "Here we go," Jim thought. "Time to push into it. Tell me more." Frank shook his head. He was smirking. "You know, I've read your books, right? Dr. Jim Dunham. Fear the dark long enough, and it'll become a vampire, a werewolf, or a Sasquatch. A reason to stay out of the woods and next to a campfire. Sound familiar? You're an elegant guy, I'll give you that. Much more elegant than the people you interview. People like me." Jim took another sip of his beer. He told his rep at the publishing company where he was going. But that fact was doing little to ease a building sense of threat. Would anyone be able to find him out here if something bad happened? It takes little more to sustain a legend in the middle of the woods, and if the mind's as simple as the lonely, Frank parroted. "Were you lonely when you wrote that, Jim?" "Okay," Jim thought to himself. "Time to get myself out of this one. What is this, Frank? You think you're the first backwoods nut to try and rattle me?" He stood up and chucked his half-empty beer into the woods. "Thanks for the beer. I'll see myself back to the road." Jim held up a middle finger as he walked away. An airy feeling swarmed through his head, a dizziness that worked its way down to his legs. His vision started to spin. "Hey, how's that beer, Jim?" Frank started laughing. He jumped up and embraced Jim on the shoulder. Jim pushed him hard. "Stay away from me, you fucking nut. I told people I'm out here. They know I came to see you. Anything happens to me, and your backwoods life is over, understand?" "Oh, that's all right. Just take it easy. We're going to make history together, you and me." The haze grew worse. Frank kept talking, but the words jumbled together. Just noise, senseless noise. Jim choked back nausea and an urgent need to lay down. His heart raced into his ears, as if he worked harder and harder to fight gravity. You fucking, His tongue struggled against thickening saliva. Then everything went black. It was a summer heat that came through first, a blur of sunlight that broke into sensations of head pounding against skulls. He opened his eyes to a thick wood. A sharp burst of pain fried through Jim's leg and up his nervous system. Something rough dug into his back as he squirmed against the rope. He was tied sitting against a broad oak. His right leg cocked to the right, broken at the knee. He screamed in agony. "I'm real sorry about that, Jim." Jim searched for the voice that projected from somewhere above. A camo-clad Frank squatted from a tree standing high in Jim's right, a large bow in his hand. "I guess you could say you're walking a mile in my shoes, you see. It was here when I first saw her. She stalked me just past this group of trees over there. I've fallen just about where you are now, shattered my pelvis. At first, I thought she was just checking me out. She came sniffing, like a bear, you know, only much bigger. Much bigger. I went out cold after that. I woke up to her taking a chunk out of my shoulder. I had an arrow in my hand, so I dug it into her eye." Jim struggled against his binds. "Frank, listen. Frank, I'm hurt real bad down here. Untie me. Please, Frank." "I just can't do that. I didn't want to hurt you, Jim, but I think it's the only way to get her here to come. Try not to panic." Jim thought. Appeal to the humanity. Set middle ground. "I believe you, Frank. I fucking believe you," he said between heaving breaths of pain. "Untie me now, and it all ends here. I won't tell anyone, and you can still take this back." "Can't. A smart person like you should know better than that. Besides, you should try and appreciate this. You're about to see the very thing you spent your life not believing in. Imagine what a hot shot you'll be around your professor buddies, and then no one's got a story like this." Anger. He couldn't hold it back any longer. "There's no such thing as a Bigfoot, you dumb, backwoods, inbred idiot. You were in shock, probably hallucinating." "Oh, Jim. You're really setting to hurt my feelings. Tell you what, you sit down there squirming till midnight. If she don't come, I'll untie you and drive you to the nearest police station. I'll go quiet and nice, and you can write your best book yet. Hillbilly kidnaps a professor to use as bait in a Sasquatch hunt. Sounds better than that other shit you've peddled out. Probably earn you a place in the bestseller list for eternity. I'm going to kill you for this. You hear me, bastard? I'm going to watch you die. I'm going to watch." He was dizzy again, lightheaded. "Big talk from the big guy who tied to a tree," Jim heard as he again lost consciousness. Jim awoke to the darkness and the buzzing of cicadas. The sharp pain in his leg had subdued by an intense pulsating ache. His eyes adjusted slowly. see the outlines of tree stalks taking shape into the dim moonlight that trickled from the canopy above. "Frank," he yelled out. No answer. "Frank, God damn it, answer me." Still nothing. He took a deep breath. A skunkish smell filled his lungs and almost made him dry heave. It wasn't quite skunk-like. It had a filth to it, putrid like rotting meat. He squirmed and felt a bit of slack on the ropes. They must have loosened throughout the day. He worked at it in his shoulders until the rope burned against his skin. Stay calm, he thought to himself. Breathe. Try to slow your heartbeat. His vision began accumulating. The shapes of the trees became sharper. He stared into the night and slowed his breath. Trying to ignore the smell, a flash of movement caught his attention. A distant silhouette passed from one tree to another, or so he thought. The more he looked, the more movement there seemed to be. Maybe it was nothing. A thick-sounding branch cracked from somewhere ahead. His heartbeat quickened. Adrenaline replaced his aches and rising fear. "Frank!" he yelled. No answer. He scanned what he could, taking a second glance at a thicker tree about 100 feet away. It looked unnatural compared to the others. A shadowy, bulky protruded from its left. Had it been there before? He tried not to blink. It moved. The silhouette rising about 6 feet and stepping out from behind the tree. Jim recalled stories of bear attacks, brown bears that mauled their victims to near death, buried them, and came back out to eat them again while the victim was still alive. No, it was much taller than a bear. The shadow disappeared into a group of trees to his left. The foul smell grew in intensity. Jim waited in complete stillness. Another branch snapped to his left. The ominous shadow stood distant. He could make it out better than this. He stood at least a dozen feet tall, maybe taller. All shapes of monsters flooded his imagination until there was only one. Frank said that the thing had stalked him. Is that what he was doing now? Was this really happening? He watched it carefully, looking for any slight motions. Were his eyes playing tricks on him? He adjusted his back slightly to get a better view. The sudden movement caused the thing to jump back and crouch. It was fast, graceful even. He always imagined Bigfoot moving in slow, hulking strides, like a clumsy gorilla in a badly shot video. But this was not that. He thought back to bear encounter stories. Yell, try to make yourself look big. Someone had told him once he yelled. The thing kept still in its crouched position. He yelled again, louder and longer, until his head ached. Whatever it wasn't bothered. He leaned forward against the ropes and rocked his shoulder. A little more slack, a little more burn. Not a lot of hope. The thing stood and stepped 2 strides closer. He kept rocking. The ropes gave slightly with every movement. He focused all of his energy. Little by little, the enormous figure approached. Its movements grew less cautious and slow. Jim tried to not look back. It seemed to move more when he looked away. The pain in his leg grew sharper. Each shift against the ropes made it worse, and he had to grit his teeth to keep from yelling. Then the thing charged against him. The force of anticipation caused Jim to brace back hard against a tree. It came within feet before jumping back into a crouch. A false charge, Jim thought. It was testing him. From where he was shifting, and sitting, his head was now against mid-shin level with it. Its features were ape-like and giant. A stocky torso with a mane-like neck. Escape seemed less possible. He had nothing left to give. He collapsed back, tried, and surrendered. The thing's false charge had sapped his adrenaline. All he wanted was for the pain in his leg to stop. He slumped. As he did, the thing rose. Its steps grew bolder, less like an afraid animal. 15 feet. 10. Its size grew until it stood over him. He shut his eyes. His body trembled under the terror. He didn't want to see it. He just wanted it to be over. He tried not to whimper as his breathing quickened into panic bursts. He felt his hot breath against his skin as it stopped down and sniffed Jim's head. He opened his eyes and met the cruel stare of a terrible, stinking face. The eyes were sunken beneath the protruding brow. A scar marked a gaping right socket where Frank had struck his arrow. Its lips bared back and revealed large canines. Everything in him wanted to sprint, run, move. His trembling was now uncontrollable. He hoped it would be quick. Jim heard Frank's bowstring snap, followed by a meaty slap. The thing jumped back with a loud howl. It turned to rush Frank's tree stand, moving with incredible speed. Jim twisted his aching body and just could make out Frank struggling to load another arrow. He didn't stand a chance. It had him in seconds. Gripping Frank like a stick, it threw him straight into the ground. Frank smacked the forest floor with an impact that turned his body into a motionless pile of broken flesh and bone. The thing stood over the pulp, pouting with his fists for good measure. Jim struggled for his life against the ropes. He was free. He crawled, digging with elbows and one good leg against the dirt. He made it a few feet when a crushing weight landed between his shoulder blades. The thing pinned him under his foot and pressed harder. Jim's ribs cracked under the awesome pressure. In his last moments of life, Jim felt the creature grab the back of his hand and pull. The sound of his tearing tendons snapped in his ears. Skinwalkers. As legend goes, to become a skinwalker, you must obtain priesthood, and then kill a member of your own family. Then, and only then, can you gain the powers to shapeshift. Then, and only then, are you a true skinwalker. According to local folklore, a man had done just that. An Indian priest had supposedly not only killed one, but 5 immediate members of his family. They never caught this man. He disappeared into the woods, never to be seen again. When Jason and Alex set out for their camping trip, they knew all the old legends, and they laughed at the idea that a skinwalker would come get them if they trespassed on the old Indian land. The same land that has the supposed murders had taken place. And why should they believe the legends? A man becoming a beast was probably the most ridiculous, imaginable thing. Jason and Alex were brothers. They spent their entire lives together until Jason had gotten married. Then Jason moved away. He started a family, but not Alex. Alex stayed in their hometown, tending to their parents, making an honest living off the land. And he tried to be a good person. And Alex had succeeded at this. He hadn't broken a commandment in years. And well, he was well on his way. Well in his own mind. To heaven. 3 years had passed between their last get-together. 3 more might have passed if Alex didn't insist on a camping trip. But insist he did. And there they were. It was getting dark. And the two of them were laying out under the stars. They were deep in the woods. They had no GPS or maps. But they knew the path back from where they were. They had gone there as kids. Never know. Huh? Alex replied. He only caught bits and pieces sometimes. We can never let Dad know, Jason reiterated. Know what? That we stayed on the old Indian land past dark. We promised him as kids. And I wouldn't want to upset him now. He's getting pretty close to dead. And if we started an argument now, we may not resolve it in time just for, just don't tell him. Or Ma. Okay? Okay. No problem. They were both silent for a while. Until they upcreeped a small raccoon. Well, look at that, Alex called, as he pointed towards the critter. He stared at them for several minutes, not moving, not attempting to flee when they motioned towards it. It stayed almost perfectly still, and then finally it left. Minutes later came a deer. Again, the creature stayed there and watched them. Unwavering determination glared in its eyes. For about 2 hours, the duo was kept awake as every animal they knew to live in the forest, and some they were almost sure didn't inhabit the area, came to gaze upon them. The final animal was a great wolf. It slowly moved towards them, and when it was about 5 feet away, it stopped. Don't move. Don't pin. It'll go, Jason assured Alex. The wolf slowly stood up onto its hind legs. Then its limbs began to contort and pop. Horror slid over Jason's and Alex's face as they saw the fur tear open, revealing light brown flesh underneath. Finally, they gazed upon what looked like a man with a wolf head. The skull of the wolf split open like a melon, the fur sliding off of it, the bone chipping and falling like a fragile eggshell. And in its place slowly grew out the head of a man. The man now stood before the paralyzed brothers. They couldn't seem to move. This is my land, said the man, with an almost supernatural smile. Now, mister, I'm going to have to ask you to go. Alex trailed off. Go away from us, Jason said as fiercely as he could. The man began to laugh. And as he continued to laugh, the pitch changed. It grew deeper. From that of a man to more of a demon. And soon it sounded as if Satan himself was bellowing at them. The man's skin grew black as coal, and his eyes yellow like cats. His demonic laughter echoed through the forest. As he drew closer and closer, the brothers being unarmed, they had no choice other than to flee. And that's what they did. They ran as fast as they could. Except instead of out to their cars, they were cornered into running deeper into the woods. For hours, they seemed to play cat and mouse. Several times, animals they passed would burst open into a grotesque manner, revealing the deranged man. But they continued running. Finally reaching a cabin, they ducked inside. They were filled with fear, and the brothers felt that leaving the cabin would end in their deaths. What they found in the cabin made them regret their ignorance on legends. For in the main bedroom of the cabin were corpses, at least 100 of them. Every animal that they had seen that night was there, along with some larger bodies, some human bodies. It was then that the man burst into the room, except he was once more a wolf. In his deep voice, he snickered. "Welcome home." The following week, the authorities found the cabin during their search for Jason and Alex. Both brothers' faces looked as if they were eaten by an animal of some sort. 6 days later, a security camera several states away overcaught Alex filling up carbon gas. Several eyewitnesses also reported seeing the dead man. In nearly all accounts, he was seen smiling a wide, toothy, unnatural grin. Credited to Kamen Rider Chrome r/scary stories. The Doppelganger. I never truly had a problem with where we lived. It was a secluded area, but that also just meant privacy was easy to come by. It was a small county in eastern Tennessee that had maybe 100 houses or so. It was just me and my parents, alone in the mountains. Mom had gotten used to the mountain life and never gave much thought of leaving. My dad worked as a county game warden and usually never got home until around 8 or 9 at night. I remember one night, though, he came home rather early. See, he always had his keys to open the door with him and would typically come right in, grab something to eat, sit in his recliner, and then head straight to bed. But tonight, he came in and silently sat at the table, not moving or eating. He just sat there with his head in his hands. "Anything wrong, Dad?" I asked him. He turned to look at me with a grim look of sadness crawling all over his face. Oddly enough, it seemed to quickly contort to a look of concern now. "Mike has been missing from the station for almost 2 days. Nobody has been able to track him down, and his family is becoming restless. It's just been hard to face his wife and kids who think they just lost their husband and father. That's all, buddy," he told me with an almost solemn tone to his voice. Mike was his partner for the past few years, and he was a younger man, no more than maybe 30 years old. Mom came in and started having a conversation with Dad while I returned to the TV. Their voices both cracked from time to time. I presumed it was due to the gravity of the situation. About 10 minutes later, Dad returned to the living room with Mom, and they turned off the TV while I was watching it. Hey. Before I could protest, they both looked at me and spoke. "Son, until this is all clear, I want you to promise me a few things, okay? From now on, don't open the door for anybody. Me and your mother both have keys, and we can let ourselves in," he told me while I listened intently. "We won't have a need to knock or call for you. And if you hear any of that, simply ignore it and go to your room. You have our cell phone numbers, so please just call us if you need to," he finished. I nodded my head, slightly concerned about the exact reasons for these specific rules, but it wasn't out of the ordinary for my parents to be occasionally strict. To their terms, I went to sleep. I was on winter break from school, so I had no reason to rise early. The next morning, I got up while Mom was sending Dad off for work. They always gave each other a peck and said, "I love you," before parting ways. This morning, though, seemed somehow more dire than usual. There was a grave sense of concern in my mother's voice as they said goodbye. The day was rather normal, up until it was time for Dad to come home. He didn't use the keys like usual. He just knocked. I almost didn't think it was him until I remembered his truck lights pulling in through the window. I figured I'd play along and open the door with a funny face or a joke to greet him. But when I opened the door, I was only met with a furious father. "Trey, what was the one simple rule I told you to follow?" he said. His voice was stern and angered. I'm I'm sorry, Dad. I knew it was you, I replied. No, you didn't. You just thought it was me. I told you I would let myself in. His voice bellowed loudly at me. My mom walked in and seemed to try and calm him down. Henry, he's just confused, and I'm sure he won't make the mistake again. Go easy on him, my mom said softly. Dinner was quiet that night. Between Dad being furious with me and Mom trying to keep the peace, you could cut the tension with a knife. Mom tried breaking the ice. Any updates on Mike? She asked. We got a call this morning. They found him down by Deer Point Creek, he said, sounding somewhat helpless. Well, that's great. I'm sure his family was relieved, Mom said to him. Dad, he looked up with tears in his eyes, and it took a moment for both me and my mom to realize the gravity of the situation. Mom never asked if he was found alive, and now, somehow, we knew she didn't need to. Both of you, Dad said in a demanding voice. I don't know if it's a person or a thing, but right now, this mountain isn't safe. I can't explain the testimonies and stories that I've got surrounding Mike, but I know that whoever did this is smart, he told us. They're posing as other people, pretending to be someone they're not so that they can get into their homes and lives, he said. Dad looked over at me and saw the concern in my eyes. He excused me from the table and said he loved me before sending me to my room so he and Mom could talk. I tried listening, but I couldn't make out what was being said. Mike. Wife. Body. 2 weeks. Old. Hiding. House. 2. Missing is all I could make out from their chat. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The jumbled words I had made out played in my head over and over, like a blank record. I tried piecing together the bits of conversation that I'd just heard, but so far, I had Mike's wife said, body, 2 weeks old, someone hiding in the house, 2 kids missing. I shuddered at the own thoughts going on inside my mind. What I made up? Mike's wife said his body was found to be 2 weeks old, even though they found it this morning, and apparently he was only missing for a few days. That begs the question of who was with his family all that time. We're interrupted by a knock at the window. That made my heart stop. It was too dark to see anything, but the person knocked again. Craig, can you let me in? He said. I recognized the voice. It was my father's voice. Dad? What are you doing outside? I asked. He took a moment to respond. I thought I heard something and went to check it out. But the door shut behind me. It's cold out here. Buddy, let me in. I was still frozen in fear. But somehow my concerns got worse as a figure appeared in my doorway. It was my father, wearing his typical loungewear pajamas. He held up a finger in silence to me, signaling me to be quiet. Hey? The voice from outside called out. My dad erupted so abruptly that I jumped in my bed. Get away from my house! Stay away from my family, he yelled. The voice from outside never replied. The only sounds I could hear were what seemed like low growls and something that sounded similar to a cat's purr. My dad wrapped his arms around me and told me it was okay, and he was proud of me for not complying to the person's request. The next morning, Dad called off of work. He decided to stay home with me and Mom, presumably to ensure whatever was out my window last night wouldn't come back. That night, around 9 at night, we all 3 heard a knock at the door. My dad didn't respond and held his hand up to signal all of us to remain silent. Guys, it's just me, the voice rang out. I'm headed to the station for an emergency. Did I leave my keys in the house in there? He replied. My mother had tears swiftly form in her eyes, while my heart began to beat faster and faster. I was hoping you'd show up tonight. I wanted to catch you off guard, my real father called out to the voice. The only noise that followed was a quick yelp, like a dog had been frightened, and the patter of feet scurrying away. Henry, what was that? My mother asked him. My dad held his head down, and as he thought about how to respond, I don't know, Amanda. but I know it once in this house," he replied in a hushed tone, radioed for several of his officer friends to come to the house. When they arrived, they found out that our mailbox was torn to shreds, our flag torn from the house, and small holes dug into the yard everywhere. Whatever was at our door must have thrown a tantrum after Dad sent it away. We all three walked outside, and Dad agreed to attempt to follow the being with his friends. He made Mom promise to not open the door like usual. As we both made our way back inside, I went straight to my room to hide under the blanket and pray that I wouldn't hear a knock or a call. My pleasant surprise, I didn't. About an hour later, Dad called to tell us that he was on his way home and they couldn't find anything. I presumed Mom was still in shock. She didn't reply. She only weakly nodded her head. Dad got home and walked straight through the door. He was scared about something, but also mad too. Trey, Amanda, who left the door unlocked. He yelled at us. Mom tried calming him down. "Honey, nobody knocked or tried to come in. I've been watching the door all night," she assured him. Dad looked around frantically. "Henry, I think you're just paranoid about us. We're okay, and so are you," she told him. They both walked to their bedroom as I returned to mine. Next morning, I woke up and found the house vacant. Mom nor Dad was in their room, and I saw the front door open and presumed they were outside. But then I smelled something. It was kind of vile and disgusting. The smell was coming from their bedroom. I walked in and the putrid aroma was coming from within their closet. I opened the closet and realized just how crucial our mistake was last night. I saw the body of my mother. A single slash wound in her neck had caused blood to spill out everywhere on the carpet. I cried as I stood there, fell to my knees. My own mother died in front of me. As I looked at her body, my mind began to flare, as if I had noticed something without actually noticing it. My mother didn't have a mole under her eye. As a matter of fact, her eyes were uneven, with her left eye almost dropping below her nose. She had no teeth, but upon further inspection, she had no place for them. This woman, or thing, wasn't my mother at all. As that thought crossed my mind, I looked up to see both my parents storm into the room with the police. They apologized to me while escorting me outside. They said they had hoped to catch me before I woke up to explain, but the story I was given was clearly a fabricated story to shield me from what really happened. I was told a woman was trying to break into our house after Dad had written her a ticket that pushed her over the edge, but I wasn't buying it. I knew this thing was capable of far more than just being a psycho. Psychos don't manipulate voices and faces at will. Whatever this thing was, it was dead. That's all that matters to me. As we walked to our car to allow the investigators to continue, I looked up at my dad, who had his arm around me, and I noticed something. Did he always have black hair? My father told me a story once. I'll never forget it, for a few reasons. I think it's the first story he ever told me as a child. It's also the story of how my grandfather died, but honestly, that isn't the reason. You hear stories on TV, or sometimes you overhear something in a public place. People talk about ghosts and aliens, and you think to yourself, that ain't real. They're making it up. Or they're just straight mistaken. Maybe they're crazy. Something like that. You just can't believe it. That is, until something happens. Something that brings it all together. Connects the dots in a way you didn't think. Maybe it happens to you. Or maybe you hear the same story again and again from different people. It doesn't take long for the world to become a lot bigger than you thought it was. As I said, this is a story my father told me, but I never believed it. Even though he swore up and down it was true. It wasn't until I started clicking around the internet that I started to believe. I started to hear other stories just like the one my father told me. It didn't take me long to believe after that. That's not what my father called it, of course. He's never used the internet in his life. He wouldn't know what the online community had taken to calling it. When he chose to call it something other than it or that thing, he called it a skinwalker, after an old Cherokee tale his grandfather told him. But I'll tell you the story the way he told it to me. We were out hunting one night in the woods surrounding the dairy farm in Ohio, where we lived at the time, he'd tell me. We were tracking coyotes. We'd kill them for $50 a skin. They'd kill calves sometimes. We'd do it every night because we needed the money. Sometimes, while we were out, we'd come on a deer and kill it. Our landlord didn't mind, and it could feed our family for a few nights and save us some money. Anyway, we were done making our rounds and heading home, walking because we didn't have a car or four-wheeler back then. We'd cut through the woods. That's when we came upon it. Blood everywhere, splattered on the trees, in the grass, in the creek, everywhere. At first, we figured it was a pack of coyotes. We'd seen how sometimes when they weren't able to scavenge for whatever reason, they'd start hunting deer or cattle out of desperation. The worst was when they bred with feral dogs. But this wasn't like that. You see, when a pack of dogs, wolves, or coyotes attack something, they'll do it right. They'll pick off one that's weak, sick, or old, or just small. They'll hunt it, draw it into a corner, someplace it can't get out of, and they'll run it right to the biggest one, the alpha. And that deer will never see that alpha. It might hear it, but it won't see it. All of a sudden, its throat will be torn out, and it will drop dead. It's quick, and it's clean. This isn't what happened here. Something had come upon a group of deer. See, coyotes won't attack a group. Wolves won't either. They'd get too much of a fight. There were three, I think. 3 bodies. Just torn apart. You see a head or a torso here, a leg there. Predators don't do that. They don't leave scraps behind. Whatever had done this hadn't done it for food. It had done it for fun. But we didn't know that at the time, of course. We just saw a bunch of carcasses and figured it's something we had to take care of. I remember my dad telling me to go home, that he thought it was the work of a pack of feral dogs. But I wasn't leaving him, and I damn sure wasn't hiking through 2 miles of woods alone, in the dark, with nothing but a .22 and a pocket knife. I was only 13 at the time, so a .22 rifle was the only gun I could reliably use. Dad had the shotgun, and I wasn't going anywhere without it or him. It took me a while to convince him, but finally we began tracking whatever did that. It wasn't hard either. We just followed the blood. Either that thing bled a deer before it got away, or it dragged one for a mile. I don't know. What I do know is that I'd never seen my dad scared before that night. We started hearing the most horrible sounds now. I've been in a lot of woods in my life, and I've been all over the world, but I ain't never heard noises like I heard that night. I heard things screaming. I've heard deer, fox, rabbits, raccoons, and birds. All of them afraid of something and hightailing it. Keep in mind, this is maybe 12 or 1 o'clock in the morning. Except for the fox and some birds, nothing was supposed to be awake at that hour. But they weren't just awake, mind you. They were on the run. That night, I saw a flock of birds flying straight into trees trying to escape. Something We came upon a pack of coyotes and nearly shot a couple thinking they had their eyes on us. But then we saw they were running from someone. Nothing towards us. They didn't even notice us and went right past. Then some deer did the same. Then rabbits, squirrels, and foxes. Even honestly, a couple wild hogs. These critters were supposed to be hunting each other, and the only thing they cared about was getting as far away from there as possible. We should have put 2 and 2 together. That maybe whatever we weren't tracking wasn't something we were supposed to see, and wasn't something we could kill. To this day, I don't know why we didn't just go home. I guess we were curious. I think that was my dad's nature, to go toward trouble, to fight. And being aware of things my father did during the war, I figured it was best to stay by his side. We finally reached an open valley. It was a normal soy field, but it wasn't in season. So it was flat, all dirt. And that's when we saw the tracks. Animals fleeing the forest had leveled everything in their path. But where that deer blood was, nothing had taken a single step. It was like whatever was responsible had left it for us to find. The tracks were shallow. Whatever it was couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds. But that didn't mean much. A bobcat weighed 40 pounds soaking wet, but it can tear out your throat if you ain't careful. The fact this thing was on the lighter side just meant it was probably quick and it was going to be a tough hit. So we followed the tracks, and it didn't take us long to find where they led. There's an old schoolhouse that sits at the top of the hill. Half of it had been ripped up by a tornado, but nobody lived there. Not for a long, long time. Sometimes we got homeless people in there, or drug addicts looking for a safe place to shoot up. We figured maybe that was it. Maybe it was some sick kid riding a high. But we didn't think that for long. When we got to within 50 yards, we heard a noise. A sort of screech made up of 2 different sounds. One was high-pitched and another was a low growl. It was making both sounds at the same time. If that makes any sense. We approached to within 20 yards. And then we heard another sound. Different this time. I remember thinking that it sounded like a paper being torn apart, while someone was also swinging a water bucket back and forth. Dad looked at me, knelt down, and whispered. He told me I had to stay behind him because we're about to corner our prey. Any animal will fight when it's cornered, especially a predator. But we can tell by the tracks that there's only one. He tells me it's probably a single feral dog, most likely rabid. The plan, he said, was to sneak up on it while it was eating, shoot it, and then keep shooting it till it didn't move anymore, then slit its throat. And if it got to Dad, it was my job to shoot or stab it to get it off him. So he walked up with me right behind him, just a tad to his side, so I could see what it is. I wish to this day I hadn't. It was leaning over a carcass, tearing off its flesh and throwing what it didn't nibble at a side. There was blood all over the brick, glistening in the moonlight. It was pale white and looked a little like a man, but not quite human. He had arms and legs like ours, but it sat like a monkey, hunched over, and its hands weren't normal. It had long fingers with claws at the end. So we saw that, and my dad hesitated. He wasn't about to fire at a person, so he cleared his throat to try and get it to turn around. I swear to God Almighty, all the noise just ceased in an instant. I ain't ever heard true silence before that, and never again afterward. But for 2 seconds, nothing made a noise. And I mean nothing. This made it all the louder when that thing turned around, made his shrill cry, and pounced on Dad. He got a shot off. I think it missed. If he hit it, it didn't phase the thing at all. But it was on him, tearing entire parts of him off. I started shooting at it with a 22, point blank, but the thing barely bled at all. I got off all of 5 rounds, and then I started hitting it with the butt of the gun. It didn't budge or even register that I was there. It was clawing at my dad, removing whole chunks of his flesh. It started on his torso, peeling off the skin of his chest, and then it moved up. It tore out his throat, ripped his nose clean off, and then gouged out his eyes. Then it scalped him and started digging in. I stood there, helpless, as it ripped off the bottom half of his jaw, the little bones, and that tube at his neck, and then his ribs. I don't exactly remember what happened, but somehow my dad's knife ended up in this thing's shoulder, and my dad, what was left of him, that is, ended up on my back. I was running, and by God, I was going faster than I have ever run before, and it was following me. I ended up back in the forest, opposite of the woods we started in. I was heading towards my landlord's house because it was the closest thing to help nearby, but even that was half a mile away. All the while, I could hear the thing screeching and moaning. I heard branches cracking and getting thrown around. It was cracking so loud and often that it sounded like someone was taking an axe to every single tree I passed. But I never looked back, not once. The thought didn't even cross my mind. Finally, I tripped and fell into some gravel. I looked up to see my landlord and a bunch of his buddies drinking around a campfire. I screamed and cried, and they came over. I told them to call an ambulance. And my landlord looked at me and said something I'll never forget. "What is that on your back?" he asked me. Just as the words left his mouth, it dawned on him. Without saying a word, it was one of those god-awful flannel shirts my dad wore everywhere. He realized it was damn near all that was left of my dad. Aside from a bit of my father's head and torso, that's all that was there. Absolutely nothing below the waist. Suddenly we heard it, the screeching. My landlord grabbed me, causing me to drop what's left of my dad on the ground. And as I was fighting him, crying because I thought we could still save him somehow. But the truth is, my dad had been gone well before I ever picked him up. And all that I've done was carry a corpse back home. My landlord had to pick me up and throw me aside before I could go with him. He and his buddies, all of us went inside together. And they locked the doors and got their guns. The landlord asked me, "What happened? What happened?" But I didn't know what to tell him. He pieced enough of it together to understand that there was something dangerous out there. All the lights in the house were on, and someone called the cops, but they would be there as soon as they could. Usually that meant 15 minutes. We looked outside and saw it walk in front of the fire they'd made. No one knew what it was. One of them said it looked like an ape. Suddenly, something came crashing through the window. We all fired at it, but quickly realized it wasn't the thing. No, it was a landlord's dog. Well, his body anyway. His head and legs were missing. We had just started pushing things in front of the doors and windows to form a barricade when we heard something in the garage. I remember one of his friends saying that the doors were open. We heard metal and glass being ripped and smashed. We dragged the couch and TV in front of the door just for added measure. It banged around some more. But then it got quiet. Not silent, like it was before. We could hear it moving around some. The guys were talking, making sure the guns were ready. Someone handed me a pistol. No sooner than I had the cocked hammer back that we heard it again. We heard something shatter upstairs, and then we heard the screech again, except this time it was louder, and it didn't echo. It didn't fade out either, because it was inside. We all rushed to the one door that led upstairs, and when we got to it, so did the thing. It opened it just a bit, and 4 or 5 men just slammed into it, and it managed to get its hand through. Someone with a shotgun took care of that, put the barrel right up to its wrist and pulled the trigger. It blew its hand clean the fuck off. That only pissed it off, though. It started shoving the door, clawing. We were on one side, pushing as best as we could, and it was on the other, doing the same. The wood wasn't going to hold, so someone told us to keep our heads down. Suddenly, the top half of the door was gone, and my ears were ringing. There were splinters everywhere. 2 or 3 of them just had unloaded on the top of the door. I don't really know where it went after that. The police got there. I was still glued to what was left of the door. The sun was up before they pried me loose. They put me in a hospital for a while. While I was there, a whole lot of people talked to me. But I didn't respond. Not for a long, long time. When I got back home, I got a job for the landlord, working on the farm. We didn't talk much. Not about the thing. But I signed up for the army when I was 19. And he sent me down to drink some scotch as a send-off. I asked him right away what the police told him. The story they went with was that it was a wild animal, probably a wolf or maybe a bear that had migrated north. I asked him how they could say that when they had the hand. He looked at me, stunned. He told me that the hand never made it back to the station. The cop who had it in his car got into a wreck, drove into a tree, and died on impact. The hand was never found, likely taken by an animal. The cops, when they would acknowledge the hand existed at all, said it was simply the paw of a bear that resembled a man's. I never talked to the landlord again. He went missing while I was in the basic training, and no one ever saw him again. There were rumors that he owed some people some money and skipped town. But I don't think it's that simple. As for me, I never went back to those woods. I wouldn't, even if I had the whole goddamn U.S. Army at my back. That was the extent of what my father told me about the incident in the woods. There's just one problem, however. My father lied. See, when my mother died, I didn't think my father felt he had anything left, and that he might as well settle old scores. He returned to the woods, and he never came back either. The FBI was called, and they came and put on a show for everyone involved. But I knew they weren't really looking. I had to get an agent drunk and slip him a few 50s before he finally told me that they had got a few calls about those woods every year, about someone up and vanishing. But that was all he wanted to tell me. Before he got up and left with the rest of his team, he wrote the name they'd given the creature on a napkin. Of course, I didn't realize that's what it was at first. It wasn't until I put the words in a search engine online that I understood what they meant. Honestly, I would have rather not known. As it turned out, there are hundreds of stories just like my father's, as well as photos and drawings of the thing. And through the detail vary, everyone who's encountered it agrees on one thing. It's still out there, and there isn't a man on earth that can stop it.